The smell hit me first. Camphor and aged silk, underlaid with something darker, like the ghost of Chanel No. 5 that had seeped into fabric over decades. I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's climate-controlled storage room, my hand still on the brass knob, and felt the temperature drop against my skin. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Exactly. The same as it had always been. My sister Rachel's voice cut through the cold air behind me. Are you going to just stand there, or are we actually doing this today? I didn't turn around. My eyes had already found the garment bags hanging in their precise rows, each one sheathed in acid-free cotton, each one labeled in my own handwriting. Handwriting that shouldn't exist yet. Handwriting from a life I was currently living for the second time. Emma! Rachel's heels clicked on the concrete floor as she stepped past me. Seriously? Mom said you've been avoiding this for 3 weeks. The estate lawyer needs an inventory by Friday. 3 weeks. Had it really only been 3 weeks since I'd opened my eyes in my childhood bedroom, 23 years old again, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling in high school? 3 weeks since I'd realized that the catastrophic mistake of my first life, dying at 47, alone and bankrupt after a decade of legal battles, had somehow been undone? I'm not avoiding it, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You're being precious about old clothes. Rachel pulled out her phone, the screen brightness harsh against the dim, temperature-controlled atmosphere. I get it. Grandma Vivian was special to you. But these are clothes, Emma. Vintage, sure, but it's not like those aren't just clothes. The words came out sharper than I intended. Rachel looked up, eyebrows raised. In the pale light filtering through the high windows, she looked exactly as I remembered her from this age. 28, recently engaged to Marcus, a mistake, but not one I could prevent. Her dark hair pulled back in the tight chignon she thought made her look professional. She'd softened in later years, after the divorce, after her own failures had taught her empathy. But here, now, she was still the sister who had never understood. Right, she said slowly, because they're vintage clothes. Look, I know you did your whole fashion history degree, and you worked at that museum for a summer, but Sotheby's, I interrupted. I worked at Sotheby's? Whatever. The point is, Mom needs to settle Grandma's estate. The house is already sold. The jewelry's been appraised. This, she gestured at the racks of garment bags, is the last thing. We need to either donate it or sell it. Preferably sell it, because frankly, Mom could use the money for the medical bills. Medical bills. My mother's cancer treatment. In my first life, I'd fought against selling the collection, had argued and pleaded, and eventually hired a lawyer to contest the estate distribution. I'd tied everything up in probate for 2 years, during which time my mother had drained her savings, sold her own house, and eventually died in a nursing home that smelled of institutional bleach and resignation. My sister had stopped speaking to me. My father had looked at me with such disappointment in his eyes that I'd felt it like a physical weight. And the collection eventually sold anyway, piecemeal, to pay legal fees and settle debts. Scattered to the winds. Lost. Emma? Rachel's voice had softened slightly. Are you okay? You look pale. I realized my hand was gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles had gone white. I forced myself to release it, to breathe. The cold air filled my lungs, carrying with it that scent of preservation and memory. I'm fine, I said. Let's do the inventory. Rachel pulled a legal pad from her designer tote, a Prada bought with Marcus's money, though they weren't married yet. In my first life, I'd envied that bag. In this life, I knew it would end up in a consignment shop within 3 years, sold to pay rent after the divorce. Okay, she said briskly. Mom hired that vintage dealer to give us an initial assessment. She's coming at 2? We should at least know what we have before she gets here. I checked my phone. 11:47 a.m. 2 hours and 13 minutes until Judith Crane walked through that door with her practiced smile and her insultingly low appraisals. I remembered every word of that first meeting, every dismissive comment about condition issues and limited market appeal. In my first life, I'd believed her. I'd been young and grieving and overwhelmed. I'd accepted her offer of $45,000 for the entire collection, thinking I was being practical, thinking it was a generous amount for old clothes. I'd learned the truth 5 years later when I'd seen one of Grandma Vivian's pieces, a 1957 Dior gown in silk faille, sell at auction for $67,000. By then, It had been too late. The collection was gone. Judith Crane had made hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, reselling pieces she'd bought from a grieving family for a fraction of their worth. "Emma?" Rachel waved her hand in front of my face. "Where do you keep going? You're spacing out." "Sorry," I said. "I was just thinking about Grandma." It wasn't entirely a lie. I was thinking about Vivian Ashford, the grandmother who had raised me after my parents' divorce, who had taught me to see fashion not as frivolity, but as art and history and cultural commentary. She'd been a buyer for Bergdorf Goodman in the 1950s and 60s, had traveled to Paris for the couture shows, had personal relationships with designers whose names were now legendary. Her collection wasn't just vintage clothing. It was a curated archive of fashion history, each piece selected with the eye of a connoisseur. And I'd let it be sold for $45,000. Not this time. "Let's start with the evening wear," I said, walking toward the left side of the room where the gowns hung in their careful rows. Rachel followed, her heels echoing in the concrete space. The storage room had been my grandfather's workshop before he died, then my grandmother's sanctuary. She'd had it climate-controlled, had installed UV filtering windows, had even put in a dehumidifier that ran continuously. At the time, my family had thought she was eccentric. Now I understood she'd been preserving not just clothes, but pieces of cultural heritage. I unzipped the first garment bag slowly, the sound of the zipper teeth loud in the quiet room. Inside, wrapped in layers of acid-free tissue paper, was a Balenciaga evening coat from 1951. A black wool with a dramatic stand-away collar, the kind of architectural silhouette that Cristobal Balenciaga had made his signature. I remembered the weight of it, the way the fabric had been cut on the bias, so it moved like liquid despite being wool. "Pretty," Rachel said absently, typing something on her phone. "What should I put? Black coat? Designer unknown?" "Balenciaga," I said. 1951 from the autumn collection. Black wool with a silk lining. The collar is... I don't need a dissertation, Emma. Just the basics for the inventory. I bit back my response. In my first life, I'd argued. I'd tried to explain the significance, the rarity, the historical importance. I'd made Rachel defensive, had created conflict that had poisoned our relationship for years. This time, I'd be smarter. "Right," I said. "Sorry, black Balenciaga coat, near early 1950s. Rachel wrote it down and we moved to the next piece. The inventory took 2 hours. 2 hours of unzipping bags, of carefully moving aside tissue paper, of my fingers remembering the textures of fabrics I hadn't touched in this timeline. A 1947 Christian Dior New Look suit in dove gray wool, the jacket nipped in at the waist, the skirt full and falling to mid-calf. A 1962 Givenchy cocktail dress in black silk with a jeweled neckline. A 1955 Chanel suit in pink boucle, the jacket lined with silk in the iconic chain-weighted style that made it hang perfectly. Each piece was a memory. Not just from my first life, but from Vivienne's stories. She'd bought the Dior suit directly from the Paris boutique on her honeymoon. The Givenchy had been a gift from the designer himself, after she'd placed a massive order for Bergdorf's. The Chanel she'd worn to my grandfather's funeral, and then never again. "Okay," Rachel said, checking her watch. "It's 1:45. That dealer will be here soon." "What's the total count?" I looked at my own list, written in the margin of Rachel's legal pad. 47 garments, 32 accessories, bags, shoes, belts, scarves, 15 pieces of costume jewelry. "And you think it's worth..." I paused. In my first life, I'd guessed maybe $60,000 total. I'd been catastrophically wrong. "I don't know," I lied. "That's why we're getting it appraised." The doorbell rang upstairs, the sound filtering down through the old house. Rachel gathered her papers and headed for the stairs. "That must be her. Come on." I followed slowly, taking one last look at the collection laid out on the work table where Grandma had once repaired furniture. In the afternoon light, the colors seemed to glow. The deep crimson of a Valentino gown, the ice blue of a Givenchy coat, the perfect little black dress by Yves Saint Laurent. I knew what each piece would eventually sell for. The Balenciaga coat, $34,000. The Dior New Look suit, $52,000. The Givenchy cocktail dress, $41,000. But none of those were the piece that would change everything. That piece was still in its garment bag, hanging at the very end of the rack. A 1954 Hubert de Givenchy evening gown, custom made for my grandmother, in ivory silk with delicate hand-embroidered roses along the bodice. In my first life, I'd never even known it existed. Judith Crane had found it, had recognized it immediately, and had sold it privately to a collector for an undisclosed sum. 3 years ago, in my first life, I'd seen it again. Not in person, but in a catalog, Christie's auction house, important vintage fashion and textiles. The gown was attributed to Givenchy's atelier, circa 1954, and described as possibly created for a private American client. The estimate was $80,000, $120,000. It had sold for $2.3 million. The buyer, according to the art world gossip that had eventually reached me, had been a private collector who was assembling a museum-quality collection of 1950s haute couture. The gown was apparently one of only 3 surviving examples of Givenchy's early work with hand-embroidered silk, and the only one in perfect condition. Upstairs, I could hear Rachel greeting Judith Crane, her voice bright with the false warmth she used for people she was trying to impress. I took one more breath of the cold, camphor-scented air and climbed the stairs to do what I'd sworn. In my first life, I would never do again. I was going to let them sell it. All of it. Every piece. Because this time, I knew exactly what would happen. Judith Crane was exactly as I remembered her. Late 50s, silver hair cut in a sharp bob, expensive but understated jewelry, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She wore Armani, I noted. Black trousers and a cream silk blouse, low-heeled Italian leather shoes, the uniform of someone who wanted to appear successful but not ostentatious, someone you could trust. "You must be Emma," she said, extending her hand. "Your mother has told me so much about you. I understand you studied fashion history." Her grip was firm, professional. I shook her hand and forced myself to smile. "Just an undergraduate degree. Nothing too serious." "Well, I'm sure you know more than most people." She set her briefcase down on the dining room table, already assuming command of the space. "Rachel was just telling me about your grandmother's collection. It sounds fascinating." "It is," my mother said, appearing from the kitchen with a tray of tea. Margaret Ashford, my mother, looking exactly as she had at 56, thin from the cancer treatment she'd just completed, her hair growing back in soft gray curls, her hands shaking slightly as she set down the tray. In my first life, she'd had another 3 years. In this life, I was determined to give her more. "Why don't we take a look?" Judith suggested, her voice bright with professional enthusiasm. We descended to the storage room, Judith's expensive shoes clicking on each step. I watched her face as she entered the climate-controlled space. I saw the momentary widening of her eyes, the quick calculation. She was good at hiding it, but I knew what to look for now. I'd learned in my first life to read the expressions of dealers and collectors, of people who made their living finding treasure and convincing the owners it was trash. "Oh my," she said softly, walking along the racks. "This is quite a collection." She moved from piece to piece, her fingers gentle on the fabric, her eyes sharp. I watched her examine the Balenciaga coat, saw her check the label, saw the tiny smile that played at the corner of her mouth. She knew. Of course she knew. Balenciaga was having a major museum retrospective this year. Not that my family would know that unless they followed fashion news closely. The prices for his work were climbing. "The condition is remarkable," she said, more to herself than to us. "The storage is museum quality." "My mother-in-law was very particular," my mother said. "She worked in fashion for years, so she knew how to take care of things." "I can see that." Judith moved to the Dior suite, and I saw her pause. This was the moment, I remembered. This was when she'd realized exactly what she'd walked into. "This is an extraordinary piece. Early Dior, am I right?" 1947, I said quietly, "from the first New Look collection." Her eyes snapped to mine, reassessing. "You have a good eye." "My grandmother taught me." I kept my voice neutral, pleasant. In my first life, I'd been eager to show off my knowledge, to prove I understood what we had. That had been a mistake. Dealers like Judith Crane preferred ignorant sellers. Knowledgeable ones were harder to lowball. So this time, I played dumb. "Yep, but I'm sure you know much more than I do. We're just hoping to get a fair price for everything." The tension in Judith's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Of course, let me finish the assessment and we can discuss options." She spent 45 minutes examining the collection, making notes in a small leather book, occasionally pulling out her phone to photograph labels and details. I watched her linger over the pieces I knew were most valuable, saw her spend less time on the costume jewelry that, while vintage, wouldn't command high prices. Finally, she reached the end of the rack, the last garment bag. "And what's this one?" she asked, her hand on the zipper. "I don't know," my mother said. "Emma, did you inventory that one?" I shook my head. It was true. In my first life, I'd never even looked. I'd been so overwhelmed by the process, so eager to be done with it, that I'd let Judith handle the last few pieces herself. Judith unzipped the bag slowly, carefully. Even from across the room, I could see her hands trembling slightly. She knew. Somehow, she already knew. The ivory silk caught the light like liquid moonlight. The hand-embroidered roses seemed to bloom across the bodice, each petal stitched with a precision that belonged to another era, when couture houses employed dozens of seamstresses and a single gown might take hundreds of hours to create. "Oh," my mother breathed. "I've never seen that before." "It's Givenchy," Judith said, her voice carefully neutral. "1950s, I'd estimate. A beautiful piece, though the ivory silk may have yellowed somewhat. That can affect value." She was lying. The silk was perfect. They had been kept in darkness and cool temperatures for decades. There was no yellowing, no deterioration. But I said nothing, just nodded along as if I believed her. "Let me take some more detailed photos," Judith said. "For my records." She spent 20 minutes photographing the gown from every angle, making notes about the construction, the fabric, the embroidery. I watched her work and thought about the future that hadn't happened yet. The future where she would take this gown to a private collector she knew, would broker a private sale, would pocket the majority of the commission while telling my family the piece had sold for a modest sum. "All right," she said finally, carefully rezipping the garment bag. "I think I have everything I need for the appraisal." We returned upstairs. My mother poured more tea. Rachel checked her phone. Judith opened her briefcase and pulled out a leather folder. "So," she began, "you have a very nice collection here. Your mother-in-law clearly had excellent taste and took remarkable care of her pieces. That said, the market for vintage fashion can be quite volatile. Condition issues, changing trends, and limited buyer pools all affect pricing." Here it comes, I thought. The careful lowballing, the undermining of value, the gentle suggestion that we'd be lucky to get anything at all. For a collection like this, in normal circumstances, I'd estimate the total value at somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000. However, she held up a hand as my mother started to speak, "I understand you need to settle the estate quickly. Your daughter mentioned the situation with medical bills." My mother's face flushed. "Rachel, you shouldn't have—" "It's fine, Mom," Rachel said. "We're all adults here. We need the money, and Miss Crane needs to know that." Judith smiled sympathetically. "I completely understand, and I want to help. Rather than you trying to sell these pieces individually, which could take months or even years, I'm prepared to make an offer on the entire collection. It would save you the trouble of dealing with multiple buyers, auction houses, consignment shops. One transaction, immediate payment." "How much?" my mother asked quietly. "I could offer $45,000 for everything." Judith's voice was firm, confident. "I know that might seem low given the number of pieces, but you have to understand the costs involved in selling vintage. Authentication, conservation, marketing, commissions to auction houses. And there's always the risk that pieces won't sell at all." $45,000. The same number as my first life? I felt Rachel turn to look at me, waiting for me to argue, to protest. In my first life I had. I'd called it an insult, had accused Judith of trying to cheat us, had demanded we get a second opinion. It had started the chain of events that led to years of legal battles, to the destruction of our family relationships, to my mother dying in debt. This time, I kept my mouth shut. "That seems," my mother hesitated, "actually quite fair. What do you think, Emma?" All eyes turned to me. Rachel looked surprised. My mother looked hopeful. Judith looked very, very pleased with herself. I thought about the Givenchy gown, about the $2.3 million it would sell for in 3 years. I thought about Judith Crane's face when she realized I'd let her buy it for a tiny fraction of its value. I thought about the collector who would eventually own it, who would never know it had been stolen from a family in crisis. And I said, "I think we should accept." Rachel's teacup rattled against the saucer. "You think we should what?" "Accept the offer," I repeated, keeping my voice level. It's fair. It solves our immediate problem, and Mom needs the money now, not in 6 months after we've tried to sell everything piecemeal. My mother's relief was visible, like watching someone's shoulders drop after holding tension for too long. Emma, are you sure? I know how much the collection meant to you. And to Vivian. Grandma would want us to be practical, I said. The lie tasted bitter, but I forced it out anyway. Oh, Vivian would have been horrified. She'd spent decades building that collection, caring for it, planning to eventually donate it to a museum. But Vivian was dead, and her wishes had died with her. She'd want you to be taken care of. Judith Crane smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I'm so glad we could come to an agreement. I'll have my attorney draw up the paperwork. We can close within a week, if that works for you. That's perfect, my mother said. Emma, Rachel, can you help Miss Crane load the pieces into her van? Of course. I stood, my legs steadier than I'd expected. Let me show you where the garment bags are. We spent the next 2 hours carefully loading the collection into Judith's climate-controlled van. Each piece was wrapped, documented, photographed. Judith was meticulous, I'd give her that. To see, she treated the garments with genuine care, even as she was systematically undervaluing them. You know, she said as we loaded the last of the evening gowns, if you ever want to work in vintage fashion, you should give me a call. You clearly have an eye for quality, and people with your educational background are hard to find. In my first life, I would have been insulted by the offer. In this life, I just smiled. I'll keep that in mind. By the time Judith drove away, the storage room was empty except for the climate control system still humming in the corner. My mother stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears running down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know this isn't what she wanted. I know you must hate me. I put my arm around her shoulders. She felt fragile, bird-boned. I don't hate you, Mom. Grandma's gone. The clothes are just things. You're what matters. She leaned into me, and I felt her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Rachel stood awkwardly nearby, her phone for once forgotten in her hand. I'll make sure the money goes toward the medical bills, my mother said finally, pulling away and wiping her eyes. And maybe we can set some aside for you and Rachel. Vivian would have wanted you to have something. We don't need anything, Mom, Rachel said, her voice softer than usual. Just use it for yourself. We went back upstairs, and my mother started making dinner while Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Rachel spoke. Okay, what's going on? What do you mean? You gave up. You never give up on anything, especially not something related to Grandma Vivian. I was expecting a fight. Emma. I had a whole speech prepared about being practical and thinking of Mom, and you just folded. I shrugged. Maybe I'm growing up? Bullshit. Rachel leaned closer, studying my face. You've been weird ever since Grandma died. Distracted. Like you're somewhere else half the time, and now this. What's really going on? For a moment I considered telling her. About the rebirth. About the first life. About the mistakes I'd made and the chance I'd been given to fix them. But how could I explain? She'd think I was having a breakdown, that grief had unmoored me from reality. And maybe it had. Maybe this was all a delusion and I was actually still 47 and dying alone in that clinical hospital room, my brain constructing elaborate fantasies in its final moments. I'm just tired, I said instead. Tired of fighting. Tired of pretending Grandma's things can fill the hole she left. They're just clothes, Rachel. They're not her. Rachel's expression softened. Yeah, I get that. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, you know, for being the bigger person. I squeezed back, guilt twisting in my stomach, because I wasn't being the bigger person. I was being calculating, strategic, playing a long game she couldn't even see, but I couldn't tell her that. The paperwork arrived 5 days later. I read every word, every clause, every disclaimer. The contract stated that Judith Crane was purchasing the collection as is, with all items listed in the attached inventory for the sum of $45,000. There was a clause that stated all sales were final, that the family had no claim to any future profits from the resale. Standard language, Judith's lawyer assured us. Boilerplate. I signed without hesitation. The check cleared the next week. My mother paid her medical bills, put some money toward a new car to replace the one that was dying, set up small savings accounts for Rachel and me. Life went on, and I waited. At night, I dreamed of dying. It wasn't peaceful, the way people always said dying would be. There was no white light, no tunnel, no deceased relatives waiting to welcome me home. There was just the hospital room at 3 in the morning, the beep of machines, the antiseptic smell that no amount of flowers could cover. There was the nurse's gentle voice telling me my lawyer was on the phone, that the judge had ruled against me, that the lawsuit was over, and I'd lost everything. There was the knowledge that I'd spent 20 years fighting for a principle, for justice, for the acknowledgement that I'd been wronged. And in fighting, I'd lost my family, my career, my health, my peace of mind. I'd won nothing and lost everything. In my first life, after the collections sold to Judith Crane, I'd become obsessed. I'd started researching, learning everything I could about vintage fashion markets, about auction records, about the dealers and collectors who traded in high-end couture. And I'd discovered, piece by piece, exactly how much Judith had made from my grandmother's collection. The Balenciaga coat, sold to a private collector for $34,000 less than 6 months after purchase. The Dior New Look suit, auction at Christie's, $52,000. The Givenchy cocktail dress, sold to a museum in Texas for $41,000. On, piece after piece. Each one worth far more than Judith had paid for the entire collection. I'd documented everything, had built a case for fraud, for breach of fiduciary duty, for unjust enrichment. I'd found lawyers who said I had a case, that buyers had a responsibility to disclose accurate values, that Judith's lowball offer constituted fraud. I'd spent my inheritance from Vivian suing Judith Crane, and I'd lost. The judges ruled that vintage fashion was subjective, that values fluctuated, that Judith had simply made better sales than we could have made ourselves. The fact that she'd done it with knowledge and expertise we lacked wasn't fraud. It was business. Caveat emptor. Buyer beware. By the time the final appeal was denied, I was 39 years old. My mother had been dead for 2 years. Rachel hadn't spoken to me in 5. My father had cut me off completely after I'd missed his wedding to his second wife because I was in court. I was working as a part-time museum docent and living in a studio apartment in a bad neighborhood, all my money gone to legal fees and court costs. And then one day, scrolling through auction listings, I'd seen it, the Givenchy gown, the one I'd never even known existed. Christie's important vintage fashion and textiles auction, lot 47, a rare Hubert de Givenchy evening gown, circa 1954, ivory silk with hand-embroidered roses, believed to have been created for a private American client. Provenance, private collection, acquired 2009, the year after my grandmother died, the year Judith Crane bought the collection. The estimate was $80,000, $120,000. I'd called the auction house. They had tried to explain that the gown had been part of my grandmother's estate, that it had been fraudulently acquired. They'd been polite but firm. The provenance was clear. Judith Crane had provided documentation of purchase. She'd sold it to a collector who was now consigning it. Everything was legal and above board. I'd watched the auction online, unable to afford a plane ticket to New York. The bidding started at $60,000. Within minutes, it was at $100,000, then $150,000. The auctioneer's voice was calm, professional, calling out bids that represented more money than I'd earned in a year. When the gavel finally fell, the price was $2.3 million. I'd sat in my studio apartment, watching the auction results scroll across my laptop screen, and felt something inside me break. Not break cleanly, like a bone that could be set and healed. No, break like safety glass, spiderwebbing into 1,000 hairline fractures, still holding its shape but forever weakened. That night, I'd written a letter to Rachel, an apology for the years of fighting, for the stubbornness, for choosing principle over family. I'd admitted I was wrong, that I should have let it go, that no amount of money was worth what I'd lost. I never sent it. Instead, I'd thrown myself into work, had taken on extra shifts at the museum, had tried to build some kind of life from the ruins. I dated occasionally, never seriously. I made a few friends, lost them to neglect. I watched from afar as Rachel had a daughter, as my father retired, as the years passed and I became the family member people mentioned in awkward silence. "How's Emma doing?" someone would ask at a holiday gathering I wasn't invited to. "Oh, you know. Why, still in the city, still at the museum. We don't really talk." And then at 47, the headaches started. Migraines that made light feel like knives. that made sound feel like hammers against my skull. I ignored them for months, attributing them to stress and age and too much screen time. By the time I finally went to a doctor, the brain tumor was inoperable. 6 months to live, they said. Maybe less. I'd called Rachel from the doctor's office. She'd answered on the third ring, her voice cautious. We hadn't spoken in 7 years. "Rachel, it's Emma." A long pause. "Hi. I'm dying," I said. No preamble, no softening. "Brain tumor, inoperable. I thought you should know." Another pause, then softly. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too. I've been standing on a street corner in Manhattan, watching people rush past with their coffee and their purpose. I'm sorry about everything, about Mom, about the lawsuit, about being so goddamn stubborn. Emma, I know it's too late. I know you probably hate me, but I need you to know that you were right. The clothes weren't worth it. Nothing was worth losing all of you." Rachel had been crying. I could hear it in her voice. "Can I come see you?" "If you want." She'd come. She'd brought her daughter, a 10-year-old I'd never met, who looked at me with curious, unafraid eyes. We'd had coffee in my tiny apartment, and Rachel had been so careful, so gentle, treating me like something fragile. Which I was. We'd talked about small things, her divorce, her daughter's school, the weather. We didn't talk about the lawsuit or the lost years or the family that had fractured around my stubbornness, but it hung between us anyway, a ghost we both chose to ignore. "I saw an auction listing once," Rachel had said finally, staring into her coffee cup. "A Givenchy gown from Grandma's collection. It sold for over $2 million. "I know," I'd said. "I watched the auction." "Jesus, Emma, no wonder you were so angry. Anger doesn't bring it back. Doesn't change anything." "No, but it must have felt like vindication." I'd shaken my head. "It felt like proof that I'd destroyed my life over being right." We'd sat in silence after that, and eventually Rachel and her daughter left. She'd promised to visit again, but we both knew she wouldn't. There wasn't enough time, and we'd run out of things to say to each other decades ago. I'd died 3 weeks later, alone except for a nurse who held my hand and told me everything would be okay. My last thought had been regret. Sharp, bitter, all-consuming regret. And then I'd woken up in my childhood bedroom, 23 years old, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and a second chance I didn't deserve. Time moved differently the second time around, or maybe it was just that I noticed things I'd missed before. The way morning light turned the kitchen golden at 7 a.m., the specific rhythm of my mother's humming as she cooked, the smell of Rachel's perfume, Marc Jacobs Daisy, a scent I'd forgotten until I was 23 again and she was wearing it constantly. I paid attention. I said yes to family dinners. I showed up for Rachel's engagement party and smiled through Marcus's awkward jokes. I helped my mother plant tomatoes in the garden, even though I hated the feeling of dirt under my fingernails. I called my father once a week, let him talk about his new girlfriend without making the cutting remarks that had driven us apart in my first life. Small things, insignificant things, the kind of things that built a life instead of destroying one. 3 months after selling the collection, I got a job at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute. Not a glamorous position. I was essentially a glorified intern, cataloging acquisitions and assisting with research. But it was the Met, and it was fashion, and it kept me close to the world I'd loved and lost. My supervisor was a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who in my first life I'd never met, because I'd been too busy with the lawsuit to pursue museum work. She was brilliant and exacting and had absolutely no patience for sloppiness. She also saw something in me that I'd forgotten I possessed, a genuine passion for fashion history, untainted by bitterness and obsession. "You have an interesting eye," she told me one day as we examined a newly acquired Madame Grace gown from the 1930s. "You look at these pieces like they're alive, like they have stories to tell." "They do," I said, running my gloved fingers over the pleated silk. "Every garment is a moment in time. Someone chose the fabric, someone cut the pattern, someone wore it to something important. A wedding, a funeral, a moment they wanted to remember." Dr. Chen smiled. "That's why I love this work. It's not about fashion, it's about human experience, preserved in cloth and thread." She mentored me, gave me opportunities I hadn't earned, trusted me with projects above my pay grade. Under her guidance, I published my first paper, a comparative analysis of American versus French interpretations of the New Look in the late 1940s. It wasn't groundbreaking research, but it was solid, and it got my name in academic circles. At night, I worked on my own project, a database of vintage fashion auction results, tracking pieces, prices, buyers, sellers. I documented everything I could find about the high-end vintage market, who the major dealers were, which auction houses specialized in couture, which collectors were building significant archives. I was building a case, not a legal one this time, but a historical one. A record of value, of worth, of what Vivian's collection had really meant. And I was watching for the Givenchy gown. Oh, I knew it wouldn't surface immediately. Judith Crane was smart. She'd hold on to it, wait for the right moment, the right buyer. The vintage fashion market was heating up. Museums were mounting major exhibitions. Celebrities were wearing archival pieces to red carpets. Collectors were getting serious about preservation and authentication. In a few years, the market would be ready for a piece like the Givenchy, but not yet. So I waited. I had coffee with Rachel once a week, listened to her talk about wedding planning. The wedding wouldn't happen, but I couldn't tell her that. I visited my mother every Sunday, helped her with yard work and grocery shopping. I showed up. I was present. I was the daughter and sister they deserved, not the one consumed by rage and righteousness. "You seem different," my mother said one Sunday, as we folded laundry in her living room. "Calmer, maybe, like you figured something out." "Maybe I have," I said, matching corners of a fitted sheet. "Maybe I'm just growing up." "You were always grown up. Even as a child, you were so serious." She smiled at the memory. "Vivian used to say you had an old soul." The mention of Vivian sent a familiar pang through my chest. "I miss her." "I know, but she'd be proud of you, Emma. The work you're doing at the Met, the way you've been there for me and Rachel, she'd be proud." I wasn't sure about that. Vivian would have hated what I'd let happen to her collection, but Vivian was also practical, and she loved my mother fiercely. Maybe she'd understand. Maybe she'd forgive me for choosing family over fabric. The seasons turned. So Rachel's wedding was called off 6 months before the date. Marcus had an affair with a coworker, exactly as he had in my first life. I held her while she cried, brought her ice cream and terrible movies, helped her return gifts and cancel vendors. We grew closer in her heartbreak, sisters in a way we'd never quite been before. "I can't believe I almost married him," she said one night, 3 bottles of wine deep in my apartment. "What was I thinking?" "You were thinking you loved him. That's not stupid." "It feels stupid." She wiped her eyes, mascara smearing. "You tried to warn me, you know. You never liked him." I had warned her. In my first life, she'd ignored me, had accused me of being jealous and negative. This time, I'd been gentler, more subtle. I'd asked questions instead of making pronouncements. It had let her come to her own conclusions. "You deserve better," I said. "Someone who sees how amazing you are." "Yeah, well, I'm done with dating for a while." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "I'm just going to focus on my career. Maybe get a cat." She'd get 2 cats, actually, and in 4 years, she'd meet someone named David at a work conference, and they'd build something real and lasting. But I couldn't tell her that. So I just poured more wine and changed the subject. Year 2 slipped into year 3. My mother's health stabilized. The cancer stayed in remission, her strength returned. With the medical bills paid and the stress reduced, she even started dating again. A kind man named Robert, who owned a bookstore and made her laugh. They'd get married eventually, in this life. In my first life, she died before meeting him. The butterfly effect of that $45,000 check was more profound than I'd expected. So many small changes rippling outward. My mother lived, Rachel healed. My father and I maintained a cordial relationship instead of a bitter estrangement. I built a career instead of destroying it in service of a lawsuit. And still, I watched for the Givenchy gown. It finally appeared in June, 3 years and 2 months after I'd let Judith Crane drive away with it in her climate-controlled van. I was at work, taking my lunch break at my desk while reviewing catalog entries for an upcoming exhibition on 1960s youth culture. My phone buzzed with an email notification. A Google alert I'd set up years ago, tracking mentions of Givenchy and 1,954 inches and ivory silk. Christie's important vintage fashion and textiles auction, June 15th, 17. Live and online bidding. My hands were shaking as I opened the catalog PDF. I scrolled through lots: a Chanel suit, a Schiaparelli jacket, a collection of Hermes scarves, and then there it was, lot 47. The photograph was professional, shot against a neutral background with perfect lighting. The gown looked like something from a fairy tale. The ivory silk seemed to glow. The hand-embroidered roses so delicate they could have been real flowers preserved in some impossible way. The bodice was fitted, the waist tiny, the skirt a masterpiece of construction that would have made the fabric float like a cloud when the wearer moved. I read the description with the detachment of someone reading their own autopsy report. A rare and exceptional Hubert de Givenchy evening gown, circa 1954, created during the designer's formative years. Crafted from ivory silk with hand-embroidered rose motifs worked in silk thread. The gown exemplifies Givenchy's early mastery of romantic evening wear and his collaboration with skilled embroiderers. Provenance, Private American Collection, acquired 2009. Literature. Similar examples exist in museum collections, but few in such pristine condition. Estimate, $800,000, $1,200,000. The estimate had gone up. In my first life, it had been $80,000, $120,000. Someone at Christie's had done their homework, had recognized the rarity, had understood what they were selling. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. The auction was in 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks to decide what to do. I told no one. Not Dr. Chen, who might have been interested professionally. Not Rachel, who would have been confused about why I cared. Definitely not my mother. Tati would have felt guilty and tried to fix something that couldn't be fixed. Instead, I requested the day off work, citing a personal matter. I bought a plane ticket to New York with money I'd been saving for a new laptop. I booked a cheap hotel in Queens, and on June 16th, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, I walked into Christie's auction house on Rockefeller Plaza, wearing my best dress, a vintage Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress I'd found in a consignment shop because the irony felt appropriate. The auction room was smaller than I'd expected, elegant in that understated way expensive things always are. Cream walls, dark wood chairs, a podium at the front where the auctioneer would orchestrate the transfer of millions of dollars with the fall of a gavel. Maybe 60 people were seated, a mix of private collectors, museum representatives, and dealers. I recognized a few faces from fashion circles, a curator from the Fashion Institute of Technology, a dealer who specialized in French couture, a private collector who'd made her fortune in tech and now spent it on vintage Dior. I sat in the back row, my bidder's paddle in my lap, paddle number 247, registered under a fake name because I wasn't planning to bid, and watched the auction unfold. Lot after lot sold for prices that would have seemed impossible to my 23-year-old self. A Chanel suit from 1962, $34,000. A YSL Lee smoking from 1967, $52,000. A collection of Hermes Kelly bags, $178,000 for the set. Each time the gavel fell, I thought about Vivienne, about the care she'd taken with her collection, about the knowledge and expertise that had allowed her to acquire pieces that would become museum-worthy decades later. And then the auctioneer said, "Lot 47. 2 assistants brought the gown out on a mannequin, placing it on a rotating platform at the front of the room. Even under the auction house lighting, it was breathtaking. The ivory silk caught the light like pearls, and the hand-embroidered roses created a pattern that seemed to shift and change as the platform rotated. A rare Hubert de Givenchy evening gown, circa 1954, the auctioneer began, launching into the description I'd memorized. We'll open the bidding at $600,000. A ripple went through the room. That was high for an opening bid, but not unreasonable given the estimate. 3 paddles went up immediately. $600,000. I have $600,000. Do I hear $650,000? Another paddle. $650,000? $700,000? The bidding moved quickly, professionally. I watched the numbers climb. $750,000. $800,000. $850,000. At $900,000, one of the bidders dropped out. At $950,000, another. We were down to 2 bidders now. A woman in the 3rd row, impeccably dressed in Chanel, her hair white blonde and perfectly coiffed, and a man on the phone in the back corner, the Christie's representative relaying his bids. $1 million, the auctioneer said, and the room went quiet. We'd crossed a threshold, left the realm of expensive vintage, and entered the realm of museum-quality acquisition, of pieces that would be studied and exhibited and preserved for future generations. The woman in Chanel hesitated, then raised her paddle. $1,050,000. The phone bidder countered immediately. $1,100,000. Back and forth they went, climbing in $50,000 increments. $1,150,000. $1,200,000. $1,250,000. The estimate had been left behind like a sign on a highway, irrelevant once you were past it. At $1,500,000, the woman in Chanel shook her head and lowered her paddle. She was out. The room's attention shifted entirely to the phone bidder. The auctioneer looked at the Christie's representative, who was listening intently to whoever was on the other end of the line. The bid is at $1,500,000. Do I hear $1,550,000? The representative nodded. $1,550,000. The auctioneer scanned the room, looking for a counterbid. No one moved. I felt my heart pounding, felt the weight of my paddle in my lap. I could bid. I could raise the price, force the phone bidder higher, create a spectacle. But what would be the point? I couldn't afford to win, and I wasn't here to make a scene. $1,550,000 going once, the auctioneer said. Going twice. The pause felt eternal. Sold for $1,550,000 to the phone bidder. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed in the elegant room. Polite applause rippled through the audience. The Christie's representatives carefully removed the gown from the platform, carrying it away to wherever million-dollar dresses went after they were sold. And just like that, it was over. I sat very still, feeling the moment crystallize around me. In my first life, I'd watched this auction online, had seen the price climb to $2.3 million. The buyer's premium had pushed the final price higher than the hammer price. I'd felt that familiar rage, that sense of cosmic injustice. This time, I felt nothing. Or not nothing exactly. I felt the same way I'd felt watching my mother plant tomatoes, or listening to Rachel talk about her breakup. I felt present, aware, alive. The auction continued. More lots, more sales, more gavels falling. I stayed until the end, then walked out into the late afternoon Manhattan sunshine. The city was alive around me. Tourists and business people and artists and street vendors all moving through their separate narratives. Somewhere in this city, Judith Crane was celebrating her triumph. Somewhere my grandmother's gown was being carefully packaged for transport to whatever private collection had just acquired it. And I was standing on a street corner, 26 years old in this timeline, 47 in my heart, trying to decide what came next. My phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. Dinner tomorrow? Mom wants to do family night. I texted back, I'll be there, and I walked toward the subway, toward my hotel, toward whatever version of my life I was building from the ruins of my first attempt. The gown was gone, sold for less than it would have brought in my first timeline, but still for a fortune that would have changed my family's life if we'd known what we had. Judith Crane had won again. But this time, I'd chosen to let her win. This time, I'd kept my family. The question was whether that was enough. I flew back to Philadelphia the next morning and went straight to family dinner. My mother had made pot roast, which she only did when she wanted to make a special occasion of something. Robert was there, looking slightly nervous in the way he always did at family gatherings, even though we'd all made it clear we liked him. Rachel was there too, Anna looking healthier than she had in months, the breakup with Marcus finally settling into her past instead of consuming her present. Emma, my mother hugged me at the door, and I smelled her familiar perfume. Chanel No. 5 always, because Vivian had worn it and my mother kept the tradition. I'm so glad you could make it. Rachel said you were traveling for work? Sort of, I said, following her into the kitchen. Just a quick trip to New York. Very mysterious. My mother handed me a glass of wine, her eyes bright with curiosity. Anything you want to share? I thought about the auction, about the $1.55 million hammer price, about Judith Crane's percentage of that sale. Just research, I said, for a potential project at the Met. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was already thinking about what came next. About how to use what I knew to build something meaningful from the remains of Vivian's collection, or at least from the knowledge of what it had been worth. Dinner was pleasant, easy in a way family dinners had never been in my first life. We talked about Robert's bookstore. He was thinking about expanding. About Rachel's promotion at work. She'd been made senior marketing director. About my research at the Met. I was being considered for a full-time position. Normal things. Good things. The kind of things that made up a life when you weren't burning it down in service of being right. But underneath the pleasant conversation, I felt a familiar restlessness. The gown was sold. The collection was scattered. Judith Crane had won, again. And I'd let it happen. Had chosen to let it happen. But had I really made peace with that choice? Or was I just better at hiding my rage this time around? After dinner, Rachel and I did dishes while Mom and Robert sat in the living room watching television. The sound of their laughter drifted into the kitchen, domestic and sweet. "Can I ask you something?" Rachel said, elbow deep in soapy water. "Sure. Do you ever regret it? Letting Miss Crane buy the collection?" I paused in the act of drying a plate. "What makes you ask?" "I don't know. You've just seemed distracted lately. Like something's bothering you?" She rinsed a pot, not looking at me. "I looked up some of the pieces, after we sold them, just out of curiosity." My heart rate picked up. Yeah, that Balenciaga coat sold at auction for $34,000 6 months after Miss Crane bought it from us. I saw the listing online." She finally looked at me. "So," her expression complicated, "we sold her the whole collection for $45,000, Emma. That one coat was worth almost as much." I set down the dish towel carefully. "I know." "You know?" Her voice rose slightly. "You knew and you still said we should sell?" "I knew it was possible," I said carefully. "Vintage fashion values are unpredictable. We might have gotten more if we'd sold things individually, or we might have gotten less. We needed the money right away, and Miss Crane's offer solved that problem. But we could have spent years trying to sell everything ourselves. We could have hired appraisers and auction houses and dealers. We could have fought and researched and documented and argued. And meanwhile, Mom's medical bills would have piled up, and we'd have been stressed and exhausted. And it still wouldn't have brought Grandma back." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, then, "So you chose to let it go?" "I chose to prioritize what mattered. And the money didn't matter?" I thought about how to answer that. The money would have been nice, but fighting for it would have cost more than just money. It would have cost time and energy and peace of mind. It would have cost our relationship, probably. It would have turned Grandma's collection into a source of resentment instead of a gift she left us. Rachel turned off the water and dried her hands. "You're a lot wiser than I gave you credit for." "Or a lot more cynical." "Maybe both." She smiled, but it was sad. "I'm sorry I pushed you to sell. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to choose between Grandma's things and Mom's health." "You didn't make me choose." I chose." I picked up the dish towel again, "and I'd make the same choice again." That, at least, was true. Whatever regrets I had, whatever anger still simmered under my skin at Judith Crane's manipulation, I wouldn't trade these 3 years with my family for any amount of money. In my first life, I had chosen justice over love, and it had destroyed me. This time, I'd chosen differently, even if it still hurt. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the gown on that rotating platform, about the way the light had caught the embroidered roses, about the moment the gavel had fallen. $1.55 million. Judith Crane's commission would have been at least 10%, probably more. $155,000, just for finding a buyer for a piece she'd bought as part of a $45,000 lot. I got out of bed and opened my laptop. The database I'd been building for 3 years glowed on the screen. Spreadsheets tracking auction results, dealer sales, museum acquisitions. I documented everything I could find about the pieces from Vivian's collection. The Balenciaga coat, the Dior suit, the Givenchy cocktail dress. On, piece after piece. I totaled the numbers I'd confirmed. Conservative estimates based on actual sales I could document. $847,000. And that was only for the pieces I'd been able to track. There were others that had disappeared into private collections that had been sold quietly without public records. The full value of what Judith Crane had acquired for $45,000 was likely well over $1 million. Closer to $2 million, probably. Maybe more. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. Then I closed the laptop and went back to bed. In the morning, I would go to work. I would continue building my career at the Met. I would have coffee with Rachel, dinner with Mom and Robert, a life built on the ashes of my first attempt at living. I would be grateful for the second chance I'd been given, for the family I'd preserved, for the choices I'd made differently. But tonight, I let myself grieve. Not for the money. Money was just money, and I'd learned that lesson too well. I grieved for Vivian's collection, for the pieces she'd chosen with such care, for the archive she'd built and the stories each garment had told. I grieved for the museum that would never house that collection, for the students who would never study it, for the cultural heritage that had been scattered to private collectors and locked away from public view. I grieved for what could have been, so even as I accepted what was. And then I cried myself to sleep, 26 years old again, carrying the weight of 47 years and 2 lifetimes worth of regret. 3 months later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Emma Ashford?" A woman's voice, professional and precise. "Yes, who's calling?" "My name is Dr. Margaret Sullivan. I'm the Director of Acquisitions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I was hoping we could meet. I have a proposal I'd like to discuss with you." The Philadelphia Museum of Art, one of the finest art museums in the country, with a significant costume and textiles collection. What could they possibly want with me? "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to meet." We scheduled a coffee date for the following week. I showed up early, nervous in a way I hadn't been since starting at the Met. "Doctor?" Only Sullivan was already there, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She stood when I approached and offered her hand. "Emma, thank you for meeting me." "Of course, though I admit I'm curious what this is about." She smiled. "Let me get straight to the point. I understand your grandmother was Vivian Ashford." The name sent a jolt through me. "Yes. How did you—" I knew Vivian, actually, back in the 60s and 70s, when I was just starting out in the museum world and she was still buying for Bergdorf's. She had an extraordinary eye. Dr. Sullivan's expression softened with memory. We kept in touch over the years. She used to talk about you, about your interest in fashion history, your plans to work in museums. I felt tears prick my eyes unexpectedly. I didn't know she talked about me." "All the time? She was very proud of you." Dr. Sullivan took a sip of her coffee. "She also told me about her collection. She'd been planning to donate it to a museum eventually. Did you know that?" I nodded. "I suspected." She and I had preliminary discussions about the possibility of the Philadelphia Museum of Art being that institution. Nothing formal, no paperwork, just conversations between old friends. But then she got sick and Dr. Sullivan shrugged. "These things happen." "The collection was sold," I said quietly. "After she died, the family needed the money and we sold it to a dealer." "I know, I heard about that." Dr. Sullivan's expression was sympathetic but unsurprised. "These situations are always complicated, but that's actually why I wanted to talk to you. I've been following the market for pieces from your grandmother's collection." "You have?" I leaned forward, heart pounding. "Yes. I recognized several pieces that came up for auction or private sale over the past few years. That Givenchy gown that just sold at Christie's, for instance. I remembered Vivian showing it to me once, telling me the story of how Givenchy had created it specially for her." Dr. Sullivan's eyes were sharp, assessing. When I saw it listed with a generic provenance, private American collection, I knew exactly where it had come from. I didn't know what to say. My throat felt tight. "I also know that the collection was sold for far less than its actual value," Dr. Sullivan continued. "I'm not judging that decision. Families make the choices they need to make in difficult circumstances. But it made me think about Vivian's original plan to donate her collection to a museum." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we honor that plan in a different way." Dr. Sullivan pulled out a folder from her bag. "The Philadelphia Museum of Art is launching a new initiative called the Ashford Collection of 20th Century Fashion. We'll be acquiring significant pieces of 20th century couture and ready-to-wear, building a comprehensive archive that can be studied and exhibited. And we'd like to name it after your grandmother." I stared at her, speechless. "We've already secured funding for the first 5 years," she continued, "and we'd like to offer you a position as the collection's curator. You'd be responsible for acquisitions, research, exhibition planning, and public programming. It would be a full-time position with a competitive salary and benefits." My voice cracked. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it." Dr. Sullivan smiled. "I know you're doing important work at the Met. This would mean moving back to Philadelphia, restructuring your career around a different kind of work. But I think Vivian would have loved the idea. Building something new from what was lost. Building something new from what was lost. Wasn't that exactly what I'd been trying to do with my second life? Taking the ruins of my first attempt and constructing something better, something that honored the people that I loved instead of destroying relationships in service of being right? Can I ask, I said slowly, why you're doing this? The museum could start a costume collection without naming it after Vivian. Oh, without involving me. Dr. Sullivan's expression grew serious. Because your grandmother was my friend, and I watched what happened to her collection, I saw how it was scattered, how pieces ended up in private hands where they'll never be accessible to the public. I can't undo that, but I can make sure her name and her legacy are attached to something meaningful, something that will educate and inspire people for generations. She paused, then added more softly, and because I suspect you've been carrying some guilt about the sale, this might be a way to transform that guilt into something productive. She wasn't wrong. I'd been carrying guilt like a stone in my chest for 3 years in this timeline, for 25 years in my first life. The guilt of letting the collection go, of not fighting harder. We of prioritizing the wrong things in the first life, or the right things in the wrong way in this life. The guilt of knowing what I knew and being unable to act on it without destroying everything else I valued. I'd like to think about it, I said. Can I have some time? Take all the time you need. The position won't be filled for another 3 months at least. But I hope you'll say yes, Emma. I think you're the right person for this work. After Dr. Sullivan left, I sat in the coffee shop for a long time, watching people come and go, thinking about choices and consequences, and the strange mathematics of second chances. In my first life, I'd fought to preserve Vivian's collection and lost everything. In this life, I'd let it go and preserved my family. Now I was being offered a third option, a way to honor Vivian's legacy without sacrificing the relationships that mattered. It felt like redemption, or maybe just like the universe had a sense of irony. I pulled up my phone and texted Rachel. Can we talk? Something came up. Her response was immediate. Uh-oh, good something or bad something? Good, I think. I'll explain over dinner. You're buying. Deal. That night, I told Rachel and my mother about Dr. Sullivan's offer. We sat around my mother's kitchen table, the same table where we'd signed Judith Crane's paperwork 3 years ago, and I explained about the Ashford collection, about the curator position, about the chance to build something meaningful from the scattered remains of Vivian's archive. That's incredible, Emma, Rachel said. And it would mean you'd move back here? To Philadelphia? Yes, if I accept. What do you mean if? My mother reached across the table and took my hand. This is a dream opportunity. Vivian would be so proud. I know, but I've built something at the Met. Dr. Chen has been such a good mentor, and I'm finally doing meaningful research. Leaving feels like starting over? Rachel supplied. You've been starting over your whole life, Emma. Maybe this time you're starting over into something that's exactly right. I looked at my mother, at Rachel, at the kitchen that had been the site of so many meals and conversations and moments of my life. In my first life, I'd been so consumed with being right that I'd lost all of this. This time, I'd preserved it by letting go of something precious. Maybe now I was being offered a way to have both, family and purpose, the connection and work that mattered. I think I'm going to say yes, I said. My mother squeezed my hand. Then we'll help you move. Again. Rachel raised her wine glass. To Grandma Vivian. And to you for finally figuring out what matters. We clinked glasses, and I thought about time and choice, and the strange paths we take toward becoming who we're meant to be. In my first life, I'd been so sure I knew the right path. In this life, I was learning to be uncertain, to trust the process, to believe that good things could come from letting go. Maybe that was wisdom, or maybe it was just exhaustion. Either way, I'd take it. I gave notice at the Met 2 weeks later. Dr. Chen was disappointed but understanding. You're making the right choice, she said, as we had our final coffee together in her office. Surrounded by costume sketches and fabric swatches. Curating a new collection from the ground up at your age? That's the opportunity of a lifetime. I'm going to miss working with you, I said, meaning it. In my first life, I'd never had a mentor like Patricia Chen. I'd been too consumed with the lawsuit, too angry to be teachable. You're not getting rid of me that easily, she smiled. I'll expect regular updates on the Ashford collection, and I'll be calling you for research help whenever we have questions about mid-century American fashion. I'd like that. I moved back to Philadelphia in September, into a small apartment in Rittenhouse Square, close enough to walk to the museum. The first few months were a whirlwind of setting up systems, establishing relationships with dealers and auction houses, beginning the work of building a collection from nothing. Dr. Sullivan had been right. It was exhausting and exhilarating and exactly what I needed. The first acquisition for the Ashford collection was a 1961 Chanel suit, purchased from a private seller in Boston. Not one of Vivienne's pieces, I'd checked my database to be sure, but beautiful in its own right. A perfect example of the classic Chanel style. I had it authenticated, conserved, and documented with meticulous care. Then I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of responsibility and possibility, and thought about what I was building. Not just a collection of clothes, a resource for students and researchers, an archive of cultural history, a way for people to understand the art and craftsmanship and social significance of fashion across the 20th century. It was what Vivienne had wanted all along. Over the next year, I acquired 17 more pieces. Each one was carefully selected, thoroughly vetted, properly documented. I published papers about the collection, gave lectures at universities, started building relationships with other curators and collectors. The Ashford collection began to develop a reputation for quality and scholarship, for being a serious institutional resource rather than just another museum costume closet. And I watched the market, always watched the market. In my second year at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I saw the Balenciaga coat come up for auction again. The private collector who'd bought it from Judith Crane was downsizing, selling off pieces. The estimate was $40,000, $60,000. I called Dr. Sullivan into my office. I want to acquire this piece, I said. So showing her the auction listing, she studied it carefully. It's beautiful, and it fits our mid-century focus, but it's expensive for a single coat. It was my grandmother's, I said quietly, part of the collection that was sold. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Ah, I'm not asking for special treatment because of sentiment. This is a museum-quality piece by one of the most important designers of the 20th century. It's in perfect condition, it has clear provenance, and it would be a significant addition to our collection. You're right, Dr. Sullivan said. Put together a proposal. I'll take it to the board. The board approved the acquisition. The museum authorized me to bid up to $55,000. On the day of the auction, I bid by phone, my heart pounding as the price climbed. $42,000, $45,000, $48,000, $50,000. At $52,000. So the other bidder dropped out. Sold, the auctioneer said, for $52,000 to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my office. The coat was coming home. Not to Vivienne's climate-controlled storage room, but to a museum where it would be preserved and studied and occasionally exhibited, where people could see it and understand the genius of Balenciaga's construction, the beauty of his vision. When the coat arrived 2 weeks later, carefully packed in museum-quality shipping materials, I unpacked it alone in the conservation lab. The black wool was exactly as I remembered, perfectly cut, impeccably constructed, every detail showing the hand of a master craftsman. I hung it on a padded hanger and stepped back, feeling the weight of 3 years and 2 lifetimes settle on my shoulders. I brought it home. Grandma, I whispered to the empty room, not the way you planned, but home anyway. Over the next year, I acquired 3 more pieces from Vivienne's original collection. The Dior New Look suit came up at a Christie's auction, and I successfully bid $58,000 for it. The Givenchy cocktail dress appeared in a dealer's catalog, and I negotiated a private sale for $45,000. A Chanel bag that I remembered from Vivienne's accessories collection was donated to the museum by a collector who'd bought it from Judith Crane and wanted the tax deduction. 4 pieces. Out of the 94 items that had been sold for $45,000, I'd recovered 4. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And then 3 years after I'd watched it sell at Christie's, I heard about the Givenchy gown again. The call came from an unexpected source. A lawyer in New York named David Chen, who specialized in art and estates. Miss Ashford, I'm calling about a rather delicate matter. I represent the estate of Lorraine Westbrook, who recently passed away. Mrs. Westbrook was a collector of vintage fashion, and her will includes specific instructions regarding the disposition of her collection. I pulled up a browser window and searched Lorraine Westbrook. Tech entrepreneur, died at 63 from a heart attack, net worth estimated at $400 million, known philanthropist and art collector. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, "but I'm not sure how I can help." Mrs. Westbrook's will stipulates that her fashion collection should be donated to institutions that will preserve and exhibit the pieces. I think she left detailed instructions about which pieces should go where, and she specifically requested that a 1954 Givenchy gown be donated to the Philadelphia Museum of Art's Ashford collection. I nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "A Givenchy gown from 1954, ivory silk with hand-embroidered roses. Mrs. Westbrook acquired it at auction 3 years ago. According to her notes, she attended a lecture you gave at NYU about mid-century American patronage of French couture, and she was impressed by your scholarship. She wanted the piece to go to your collection." I sat down heavily in my desk chair. The gown, the $1.55 million gown that had been the centerpiece of my obsession in my first life, the symbol of everything I'd lost. It was being donated to my collection. Yes. "We would be honored to receive it," I managed. "Excellent. I'll have my office send over the paperwork. The piece will be transferred within 60 days, along with all documentation and provenance materials." After he hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at nothing. Then I called Dr. Sullivan. "The Givenchy gown," I said when she answered. "The one that sold for $1.55 million. It's being donated to us." Silence. Then, "You're joking." "I'm not. The collector who bought it died, and she left it to our collection in her will." "Emma, that's extraordinary. Do you know what this means for the Ashford collection? That piece alone will triple our visibility, will establish us as a serious institutional resource. This is—" "I know," I said. "I know exactly what it means." And I did. In my first life, that gown had represented everything I'd lost. Family, money, peace of mind. In this life, it represented everything I'd built. A career, a collection, a way to honor Vivian's legacy without sacrificing the people I loved. The gown arrived 6 weeks later, accompanied by extensive documentation. Lorraine Westbrook had been a meticulous collector. She'd had the gown authenticated by 3 separate experts, had commissioned a detailed conservation report, had documented its exhibition history and provenance. She'd even included notes from her research about Vivienne, about her years at Bergdorf Goodman, about her relationship with Givenchy's atelier. I unpacked the gown in the conservation lab with Dr. Sullivan and our head conservator, a woman named Maria Rodriguez. We worked in reverent silence, carefully removing layers of tissue paper and archival padding. When the ivory silk finally emerged, Maria gasped. "My God," she breathed. "It's perfect. 3 years old, and it looks like it was made yesterday." 70 years old, I corrected quietly. Made in 1954. 70 years old, and it's in museum-perfect condition. Your grandmother knew how to care for textiles. We hung the gown on a mannequin and positioned it under proper lighting. The hand-embroidered roses seemed to float across the bodice. Each petal worked in silk thread so fine it was almost translucent. The construction was exquisite, every seam perfectly finished, every line of the silhouette precisely calculated to create that effortless elegance that was Givenchy's signature. "We should mount an exhibition," Dr. Sullivan said. "Feature this as the centerpiece. Tell the story of your grandmother's collection, of the Ashford collection we're building. Make this a moment." "I'd like that," I said. The exhibition took 6 months to plan. We called it Ashford Collection, Legacy and Loss in American Fashion. It featured 20 pieces total, the 4 items I'd recovered from Vivian's original collection, the 17 pieces I'd acquired separately, and the Givenchy gown as the centerpiece. I wrote the wall text myself, telling the story of Vivian's life in fashion, of her relationships with designers, of the collection she'd built with such care. I didn't mention the sale to Judith Crane. I didn't mention the true value of what had been lost. I focused instead on what we were building, a resource for future generations, a way to preserve and study the art of 20th century fashion. The exhibition opened on a Friday evening in May. The reception was packed with museum members, donors, fashion students from local universities, and press. Rachel and my mother were there, dressed in their best, looking proud and slightly overwhelmed by the attention. "I can't believe all this is because of Grandma's clothes," Rachel whispered as we stood near the Givenchy gown, watching people take photos and read the wall text. "It's not about the clothes," I said. "It's about what they represent. History, art, craftsmanship, cultural values, all the things Grandma understood when she was building her collection. She'd be proud of you, you know, for making something good out of losing the collection." I looked at the gown, at the way museum lighting made the ivory silk glow like moonlight, such at the hand-embroidered roses that had taken some unnamed seamstress hundreds of hours to create 70 years ago. I thought about the journey this garment had taken, from Givenchy's atelier to Vivienne's collection, to Judith Crane's inventory, to a Christie's auction, to Lorraine Westbrook's private collection, to this museum where it would be preserved and studied and occasionally exhibited for as long as careful conservation could make it last. "I didn't lose the collection," I said slowly, understanding it for the first time. "I just let it take a different path than I'd planned." Rachel squeezed my arm. "That's very zen of you." "Or very practical," I smiled. "Either way, I'm okay with how things turned out." And I was. Not perfectly okay. There was still a part of me that burned with anger at Judith Crane's manipulation. We at the system that allowed dealers to prey on grieving families, at the $1.5 million profit someone had made from Vivienne's taste and judgment. But that anger was smaller now, controllable. It didn't consume me the way it had in my first life, because I had this. I had the Ashford collection, a growing archive that bore my grandmother's name. I had my family, alive and healthy and present. I had meaningful work that honored the past while building something for the future. In my first life, I'd destroyed everything trying to be right. In this life, I'd let myself be wrong, or at least let myself be practical, and built something better from the ashes. That was worth more than any amount of money Judith Crane had made. The exhibition was such a success that the museum extended its run by 3 months. We had school groups coming through weekly, fashion students from around the country making pilgrimages to see the Givenchy gown, collectors and dealers attending special curator-led tours. The Ashford collection went from being a promising new initiative to being one of the museum's signature programs. Dr. Sullivan pulled me aside one day as we watched a group of design students sketching the Balenciaga coat. "The board wants to expand," she said. "They're proposing we triple our acquisition budget for next year. They're talking about creating a dedicated gallery space for the collection. Emma, this is becoming something significant." "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it. "It's because of you. Your scholarship, your eye, your ability to tell the stories behind the pieces." She paused. "And your grandmother's name. That carries weight in certain circles." I thought about Vivienne, about the reputation she'd built over decades in the fashion industry, about the relationships she'd maintained with designers and collectors and fellow buyers. Even in death, even with her collections scattered, her name still meant something: quality, taste, knowledge. "She'd like that," I said, "that her name is attached to something educational." Speaking of which, Dr. Sullivan pulled out her phone and showed me an email. "I got this yesterday, from a dealer in Los Angeles. She's offering to sell us a 1962 YSL cocktail dress. She says it came from your grandmother's collection originally." I took the phone and read the email. The dealer's name was Sarah Morrison, someone I didn't recognize from my database of fashion dealers. The dress description matched one I remembered from the inventory Rachel and I had done, a black silk cocktail dress with a jeweled neckline. How much is she asking? $30,000? Which is fair market value, maybe slightly high. The question is whether we want it. I pulled up my database on my own phone, found the entry for the YSL dress. In my notes, I documented that it had sold at a small auction house in Chicago for $28,000, 2 years after Judith Crane acquired it. Someone must have bought it there and was now reselling. "I want to think about it," I said. "Can you tell her we're interested but need a few days?" That night, I did what I'd been avoiding for 4 years. I searched for Judith Crane online. Her website came up first: Judith Crane Vintage, premier dealer in fine vintage fashion. It was professional, slick, I'm full of photos of beautiful garments and glowing testimonials from satisfied sellers. There was a section about her expertise, her decades in the business, her reputation for fair dealing, and honest appraisals. I clicked through to her inventory, dozens of pieces, all high-end, all impeccably presented. A Balenciaga coat, not Vivienne's. A Dior suit, not Vivienne's. A collection of Hermes bags, a Schiaparelli jacket, none of Vivienne's pieces. She'd sold them all, just as I'd expected. Turned them over quickly, maximized her profit, moved on to the next estate sale or desperate family. I found myself typing an email before I'd consciously decided to do it. Dear Miss Crane, my name is Emma Ashford. You may remember me. You purchased my grandmother Vivienne Ashford's vintage fashion collection in 2009. I'm now the curator of the Ashford collection at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I'm writing to inquire about your records from that purchase. As you may know, we've been working to reassemble pieces from my grandmother's collection for institutional preservation. We've successfully acquired several items, including the Givenchy evening gown that sold at Christie's 3 years ago. I'm reaching out to ask if you have any documentation about the other pieces from the collection, where they were sold, to whom, for what price. This information would be valuable for our institutional records and for scholarship about my grandmother's role in mid-century American fashion patronage. I'm not looking to reclaim pieces or challenge any sales. I'm simply trying to document the history of the collection for archival purposes. I appreciate any assistance you can provide. Best regards, Dr. Emma Ashford, Curator, Ashford Collection. Philadelphia Museum of Art. I read it 3 times before sending it. It was professional, non-accusatory, focused on scholarship rather than money. It gave Judith Crane an easy out. She could simply provide some documentation and be done with me. Or she could ignore it entirely. I hit send and closed my laptop. 3 days later, I got a response. Dear Dr. Ashford, of course I remember you and your family. I was sorry to hear about your grandmother's passing. She was clearly a woman of extraordinary taste. I'm afraid I don't have detailed records of all subsequent sales. Many pieces were sold through private transactions where I facilitated connections between sellers and buyers, and those records are confidential. However, I can provide you with a general accounting of the items I recall from the collection, if that would be helpful for your research. I should mention that I saw the exhibition coverage in Art News. The Ashford collection is doing remarkable work. Your grandmother would be proud. Best, Judith Crane. I stared at the email for a long time. It was perfectly polite, perfectly professional, perfectly evasive. She wasn't going to give me real information. She wasn't going to admit to the profits she'd made. She was going to maintain her reputation as a respectable dealer who'd simply made a good business transaction. And there was nothing I could do about it. In my first life, this would have enraged me. I would have sent an angry response, would have threatened legal action, would have started a campaign to expose her practices. I would have spent years consumed by the injustice of it. In this life, I just deleted the email and moved on. Because what was the alternative? Spend another lifetime fighting a battle I couldn't win? Destroy the peace I'd built, the career I'd created, the relationships I'd preserved? No, I'd learned that lesson. Some battles aren't worth fighting, even when you're right, especially when you're right. I wrote back to Sarah Morrison and authorized the purchase of the YSL cocktail dress for $30,000. When it arrived 2 weeks later, I added it to the collection, documented it carefully, and moved on to the next acquisition. Life continued. The Ashford collection grew. I published papers, gave lectures, developed relationships with other curators and collectors. Rachel got married to David, the man she'd meet at the conference, right on schedule. My mother and Robert moved in together. My father and I had regular phone calls where we actually talked instead of just exchanging pleasantries. And sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I pulled up my database and looked at the numbers. The confirmed sales from Vivienne's collection totaled just over $1.2 million now, based on auction records and dealer reports I'd been able to verify. The actual total was probably closer to $2 million, maybe more. Judith Crane had turned $45,000 into a fortune, and I'd let her do it. But I'd also built something meaningful from the loss. The Ashford collection, with its growing holdings and its reputation for scholarship, my relationships with Rachel and my mother and my father, preserved and strengthened instead of destroyed by my stubbornness, a career that fulfilled me, New work that honored Vivian's memory in a way that fighting never could have. Maybe that was the real lesson of Rebirth, not to go back and fix your mistakes, but to learn from them. To take the wisdom of failure and apply it to different choices. To understand that being right isn't always worth the cost of being right. I'd been given a second chance, and I'd used it not to win the battle I'd lost before, but to choose a different battlefield entirely. One where victory looked like family dinners and museum acquisitions and the slow, patient work of building legacy from loss. That was enough? It had to be enough. 5 years after the exhibition opened, I received a package at the museum. It was addressed to Dr. Emma Ashford, curator Ashford Collection, and it came from a law office in Manhattan. Inside was a letter and a small velvet box. The letter was from Judith Crane. Dear Dr. Ashford, if you're reading this, then I've died, and my executor has carried out my instructions to send you this package. I want you to know that I've followed the Ashford Collection's development over these past years. I've read your papers, attended your lectures, remotely. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable, and watched the collection grow into something truly significant. You've done remarkable work. I also want you to know that I've been aware all along of how angry you must be, how you must hate me for what I did when I purchased your grandmother's collection. I won't insult your intelligence by claiming I didn't know what I was buying or what it was worth. I knew. I'm a professional, and professionals know value when they see it. What I did was legal. It was business, but it wasn't perhaps entirely ethical. I took advantage of your family's vulnerability and your youth. I paid far less than the collection was worth, knowing you had no idea of its true value. And I've profited handsomely from that transaction. I can't undo that. I can't give you back those years or that money, but I can give you this. In the velvet box, you'll find a piece from your grandmother's collection that I never sold. A 1955 Chanel brooch, gold with pearls, that your grandmother wore frequently according to family photos. I kept it all these years because something about it touched me. Perhaps the memory of your family's grief. Perhaps my own small conscience making itself known. I'm donating it to the Ashford Collection, along with a monetary gift of $500,000 to support future acquisitions. It won't erase what I did, but perhaps it will serve as a small penance. I hope you found peace, Emma. You deserved better than what I gave you. With regret and respect, Judith Crane. I opened the velvet box with shaking hands. Inside, nestled in silk lining, was the brooch. I remembered it instantly. Vivian had worn it in family photos, had told me stories about buying it in Paris in the 1950s, about wearing it to important meetings and special occasions. I picked it up carefully, felt the weight of it in my palm. Gold and pearls, classic Chanel design, worth maybe $15,000 at market. Nothing compared to the millions Judith had made from the collection. But something, a gesture, an acknowledgement. I read the letter again, trying to parse the emotions it stirred in me. Vindication that she'd admitted her guilt. Anger that the admission came only after death when it cost her nothing. Gratitude for the gift and the endowment. Grief that it had taken this long. All of those. None of those. Something more complicated than I had words for. I called Dr. Sullivan and showed her the letter and the brooch. $500,000, she breathed. Emma, this changes everything. We can expand, acquire major pieces, fund conservation projects. I know, she looked at me carefully. How do you feel about this? I don't know yet. Ask me again in a few weeks. That night, I drove to my mother's house. Robert was out of town, so it was just Mom and me, sitting in her kitchen with tea like we'd done 1,000 times before. Something arrived at the museum today, I said, and showed her the letter and the brooch. My mother read the letter slowly, her face unreadable. When she finished, she set it down carefully and picked up the brooch. I remember this, she said softly. Mom wore it to my wedding, and to your high school graduation. She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. I thought we'd lost it forever. We did, and now it's back, sort of. And she left money for the collection, $500,000? My mother shook her head. I don't know what to think about that. Me either. We sat in silence for a while, the brooch resting on the table between us. Finally, my mother spoke. Do you regret it, selling the collection to her? I thought about the question, about the 2 lives I'd lived and the choices I'd made in each one. In my first life, I'd fought to keep the collection and lost everything. In this life, I'd let it go and built something different. Neither choice had been perfect. Neither choice had given me everything I wanted, but only one choice had given me this. Sitting in my mother's kitchen, holding a recovered piece of Vivian's collection while my mother was alive and healthy and present. Only one choice had given me the Ashford collection, the career I loved, the family I'd preserved. No, I said, finally. I don't regret it. Not the choice I made. I regret what she did with her choice, but mine, I'd make it again. Even knowing what you know now, about how much money she made, even knowing that, my mother smiled, sad and proud at once. You're wiser than I was at your age, than I am now. Maybe. I just finally learned that some things matter more than being right, than winning, than justice even. I picked up the brooch, felt its weight. Grandma would have wanted her collection in a museum. Now it is, or pieces of it are. Maybe not the way she planned, but close enough. Close enough, my mother repeated. I like that. It's honest. Not everything works out perfectly, but close enough is sometimes okay. We talked for a while longer, about Vivian and the collection and the strange paths our lives had taken. Eventually, I drove home to my apartment, the brooch carefully packed in my bag. The next morning, I took it to the museum and added it to the collection. I wrote the wall text myself, Chanel brooch, 1955, gold with cultured pearls. This piece was part of the personal collection of Vivian Ashford and was frequently worn to family occasions. Donated by the estate of Judith Crane in recognition of Vivian Ashford's contribution to mid-century American appreciation of French couture. I didn't mention the sale, the profit, the years of anger. I focused on what mattered, the piece itself, Vivian's story, the ongoing work of preservation and scholarship, and I used Judith Crane's $500,000 endowment to acquire 12 more pieces over the next 2 years, building the collection into something that would outlast all of us, the anger, the regret, the complicated mathematics of loss and recovery. Life went on. The Ashford collection grew. I continued my work, my research, my slow, patient building of legacy from loss. Rachel had a second child. My mother turned 70, healthy and happy. My father retired and moved closer to Philadelphia, close enough for regular visits. And sometimes, walking through the gallery where Vivian's pieces hung in their careful lighting and climate control, I thought about the 2 lives I'd lived. The first, destroyed by my need to be right. The second, built on the acceptance of being wrong, or at least being practical. I'd never know which choice had been better. Maybe there was no better, just different paths with different costs and different rewards. But I knew this. I was here. My family was whole. Vivian's name lived on in something meaningful, and the collection that had been scattered was slowly, piece by piece, coming home. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough. Close enough. And in the end, maybe that was all anyone could ask for. A second chance to make different mistakes, to build different compromises, to find a different kind of peace. I'd spent my first life fighting for justice and lost everything. I'd spent my second life accepting injustice and built something worth having. And I'd learned finally that the price of silk and second chances wasn't measured in dollars or in being right. It was measured in the moments we chose to hold on to and the moments we chose to let go. That, more than any auction price or any collection, was the real value of Vivian's legacy. And it was more than enough. In a climate-controlled gallery in Philadelphia, an ivory silk gown catches the light. Hand-embroidered roses bloom across its bodice, each petal stitched 70 years ago by hands that are dust now. Students sketch. Researchers study. Visitors pause and wonder at the beauty of it. And somewhere in the city, a woman who has lived twice smiles at the sunset and thinks, I chose well. This time, I chose well.